They shook my hand the day they laid the pipe. That's the part I keep coming back to. A man in a clean shirt and a company. Lanyard shook my hand at my own gate and said, "Mr. Cavanaugh, you have my word. This pipeline will not affect your water. Not your wells, not your stock tanks, not the creek that runs through your south quarter. You have my word on that." I believed him. That's the part that's hardest to say out loud. I believed him. My name is Tom Cavanaugh. I farm and ranch outside of Broken Bow, Nebraska. 480 acres of mixed crop and pasture. Third generation on this place. Been here since my grandfather homesteaded it in 1931. We run about 80 head of Angus cross cow-calf pairs, and we grow corn on the irrigated ground near the creek. Our water comes from 2 wells, one shallow domestic well for the house and shop, one deep irrigation well at 340 feet pulling from the Ogallala Aquifer, and from a natural spring that feeds into a stock tank on the southeast pasture that my cattle have been drinking from since before I was born. The pipeline company was called Meridian Energy Transport. They were routing a refined petroleum products line. Not crude, they were very specific about that distinction, as if it mattered, from a terminal in Wyoming to distribution points in Iowa. The line would cross my property diagonally, about 1,100 feet of pipe, buried 6 feet down, crossing under the creek once and passing within 280 feet of my shallow domestic well. The right-of-way payment was $47,000. That was real money. My wife Linda looked at the number and said, "Tommy, that would finish paying off the North Field." She was right. The negotiation took about 6 weeks and they were professional throughout. They hired a local attorney. They paid for my attorney. They answered every question I asked. The man who shook my hand at the gate was named Carl Whitfield, Regional Right-of-Way Manager, 15 years with the company. He had a daughter who showed horses. We talked about that for 10 minutes. He seemed like a decent man. The pipe went in the ground in the fall of 2019. If you've ever trusted someone's word on something that turned out to be wrong, not a lie exactly, just wrong, stay with me. Because what happened on this farm over the next 2 years is something I think every landowner in pipeline country needs to understand. Not to scare you, to prepare you. Subscribe if you believe a farmer has the right to know what's happening under his own ground. The first sign was small enough that I almost missed it entirely. It was March of 2021, 16 months after the pipeline went in. I was doing my check on the southeast pasture, walking fence, checking the stock tank, looking at the winter wheat in the corner field, and I noticed the cattle weren't crowding the spring tank the way they usually do after a cold night. They were drinking from it, but slowly, almost reluctantly, the way cattle act when water doesn't taste right. I've raised cattle for 30 years. I know what a thirsty cow looks like when she's drinking happily, and I know what a cow looks like when she's drinking because she has to. These cows had that second look. I went to the tank and put my hand in. The water felt normal. Temperature was right, nothing floating, nothing visible on the surface. I cupped some and smelled it. Nothing sharp, nothing chemical. But there was something underneath, like the smell of a dry highway on a hot day, there for a second and then gone. I told myself it was probably algae. It was March, early in the season. The spring sometimes runs a little off at the start. Sediment disturbed by snowmelt, organic matter from the winter. I had an explanation and I used it. I made a note to check again the following week, and then I went back to the work I had planned for the day. The following week it was worse, not dramatically, just worse. That faint edge was less faint. And the cows, I had a different group in that pasture now. 12 pairs that had been there 3 days were standing at the uphill fence line in the morning instead of down near the tank. Cattle always walk toward water in the morning. These were walking away from it. Small thing, easy to explain away. But I had been watching cattle do what cattle do for 30 years, and I knew what I was seeing. By April, the cattle had stopped using that tank on their own. I was having to lock them out of the other tanks to force them to drink from the spring, and even then, they'd stand at the edge and smell it before they'd lower their heads. Cattle are not subtle about bad water. They will dehydrate before they'll drink something their instincts tell them is wrong. I had 32 pairs on that pasture, and they were telling me, clearly and collectively, that the water was wrong. I pulled out my phone and called the county extension office. The extension agent, a woman named Rhonda Peck, who has been in that office for 20 years and knows more about Nebraska soils and water than most people with PhDs, drove out the next day. She walked the spring with me, looked at the tank, took a water sample in a clean bottle, and didn't say much for a while. Then she said, "Tom, when did the pipeline go in?" I told her. She wrote something in her notebook. She said, "I'm not saying that's what this is. I'm saying let's find out what it is." The lab results came back 11 days later. The report listed elevated turbidity, trace concentrations of petroleum hydrocarbons, specifically benzene and toluene, both components of refined petroleum products, and elevated iron and manganese consistent with subsurface disturbance. The benzene reading was 4.2 parts per billion. The federal safe drinking water standard for benzene is 5 parts per billion. My cattle's spring was sitting right below the legal limit for human drinking water. I read that report 3 times at my kitchen table. Then I called Linda in from the other room and had her read it. She read it without speaking and set it down and looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the southeast pasture was visible. The tank, the spring, the cattle that had been telling me something was wrong for 6 weeks, while I kept finding reasons to wait 1 more week before acting. She said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "I'm going to call them in the morning." She said, "And if they say what you think they're going to say?" I said, "Then we do this a different way." I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was angry. Anger came later, quieter, and more useful than I expected. That night I was thinking, running through everything I knew about what had happened in that pipeline corridor, everything the company had told me, everything I hadn't thought to ask. The dominant feeling was not rage. It was the specific, cold recognition that I had trusted someone's word on something that affected my land and my animals and my water, and I had not protected myself, and now I was going to have to do this the hard way. That feeling is clarifying in a way that's difficult to describe. It burns off everything that isn't useful and leaves you with just the work. I called Meridian Energy Transport's environmental compliance line the next morning. I was calm. I gave them the case number, the lab report, the location. The woman who answered took notes and said a representative would contact me within 5 business days. 7 business days later, a man named Derek Fowler called me. He was not Carl Whitfield. Whitfield had moved to a different division. Derek Fowler was younger, had a careful voice, and used the phrase alleged contamination twice in the first 3 minutes. He said their line integrity monitoring showed no anomalies. He said the pipeline operated at positive pressure, which meant any leak would push product out rather than allowing groundwater in, and that therefore groundwater contamination from their line was, in his words, physically unlikely. He said benzene and toluene occurred naturally in some Nebraska formations. He said my water test results could have any number of explanations. He asked if I'd tested my water before the pipeline installation. I had not. He noted that. I wrote down everything he said, word for word, in a spiral notebook. After I hung up, I called Rhonda Peck. I told her what Derek Fowler had said about benzene occurring naturally. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tom, pull every water test you can find on springs and wells within 2 miles of your place going back 10 years. I've got access to the state database. Let me look at something." She called me back the next day. She said, "In the state water quality database, there are 14 sampled water sources within a 2-mile radius of your spring. None of them show detectable benzene or toluene. Not one. Your spring is the only one." That told me what I needed to know. But knowing and proving are 2 different things, and I understood by then that I was going to need more than 1 water test and a phone call with Rhonda. I was going to need a paper trail that nobody could argue with. Over the next 4 months, I did the following. I hired a certified water quality testing firm out of Lincoln, not the county extension office, a private firm with courtroom-qualified labs, and tested my spring weekly. I tested my domestic well monthly. I documented every test with date, time, weather conditions, and photographs of the sampling process. I hired a hydrogeologist named Dr. Patricia Ossie from the University of Nebraska to walk my property and prepare a written assessment of the groundwater flow patterns between the pipeline right-of-way and my spring. Dr. Ossie's assessment, which took her 6 weeks to complete, concluded that the groundwater flow from the pipeline corridor to my spring outlet was hydraulically direct, meaning water moving through the subsurface in that area would reach my spring in a matter of days, not weeks. I paid $8,400 for Dr. Ossie's report and $3,200 for 4 months of certified water testing. I did not tell Meridian I was doing any of this. The benzene readings in my spring over those 4 months ranged from 3.8 to 5.1 parts per billion, not stable, varying, which is consistent with a slow, intermittent subsurface source, not a natural formation, which would show a stable baseline. In September of 2021, I requested a formal meeting with Meridian Energy Transport. I asked for their environmental compliance director, not a field representative. I told them I had documentation I wanted to share. They agreed to meet at the county extension office in Broken Bow on a Tuesday in October. There were 4 people on their side of the table: environmental compliance director, an attorney, a pipeline engineer, and Derek Fowler, who looked at me and then looked at the table and mostly stayed there. On my side, me, Linda, Rhonda Peck, and an attorney I'd hired named James Garrett, who had spent 20 years doing agricultural and environmental law in central Nebraska. I let James open the meeting. He outlined the timeline: pipeline installation, first observation, initial testing, company response. Then he put Dr. Ossie's hydrogeological report on the table. Then he put 4 months of certified weekly water test results on the table. 47 individual test reports, each with chain of custody documentation, each signed by a certified laboratory analyst. Then he put Rhonda's analysis of the regional water quality database on the table, showing that my spring was the only water source in a 2-mile radius showing detectable petroleum hydrocarbons. The room was quiet for a while. The environmental compliance director, a woman named Sandra Voss, who had not spoken since introducing herself, picked up Dr. Ossie's report and read the summary page. She turned to the pipeline engineer and asked him a question quietly that I couldn't hear. He answered quietly. She nodded. She looked at me and said, "Mr. Cavanaugh, we're going to need to conduct our own investigation." I said, "I'd expect nothing less. I'd like to be notified before any sampling on my property, and I'd like split samples, your technician and my technician taking simultaneous samples from the same source." She agreed. Their investigation took 8 weeks. Their samples confirmed mine. The benzene and toluene readings were real, and their own hydrogeological assessment, shared because James requested it in writing, concluded that the most probable source was the pipeline right-of-way crossing, not a certainty, a significant probability. The remediation agreement we signed in February of 2022 included installation of a continuous groundwater monitoring system on my property, quarterly third-party water testing at their expense in perpetuity, replacement of my spring-fed stock tank with a connection to my deep irrigation well, and a payment I'm not able to disclose under the terms of the agreement. Carl Whitfield was not at the February meeting. I don't know where he went. The man who shook my hand at my gate in 2019 and said I had his word. I never spoke to him again after the pipe went in the ground. But here is what I want you to take from this. Not anger, not distrust of every company that comes to your gate with a check and a handshake. What I want you to take is this. Test your water before they start. Get a baseline. Put it in writing and get it dated and certified and filed somewhere permanent. It costs $200 and half a day. If nothing ever goes wrong, you wasted $200. If something goes wrong, that $200 is the most important money you ever spent. Your word against theirs is nothing. Your baseline test against their line integrity report is something. There's one more thing I want to say. Carl Whitfield shook my hand in good faith. I believe that. I don't think he knew the line would cause this, and I don't think he was lying when he gave me his word. I think he believed what his company had told him about pressure monitoring and contamination risk, the same way I believed what he told me. The problem wasn't a lie. The problem was that his company's word wasn't worth anything without documentation behind it. And I had no documentation, and by the time I needed it, it was too late to go back and get it. That's the thing I'd go back and change if I could. Not the right-of-way agreement. That money was real, and the terms were fair. What I'd change is the morning before Carl shook my hand. I'd have driven to Lincoln and paid $200 for a certified water test on that spring, and I'd have put it in a file folder with the date and the lab signature on it, and I'd have had it when I needed it. One piece of paper, $200. I had neither, and it cost me 4 months of work and over $10,000 in testing and legal fees to build the case I could have started with. The cattle drink from the new tank now. Clean water, every time, no hesitation. They crowd it the way cattle are supposed to crowd a water source in the morning. I stand at the fence sometimes and watch them and think about how simple that is. Cattle drinking clean water, and how hard I had to work to get it back. Some things on a farm should never have to be complicated. Clean water is one of them. If this hits you, subscribe. Leave a comment. Tell me what's running under your land. I read everyone. See you in the field.